Hasan feels like he's not making much of an impact on the broader audience.
Yeah. Dude, how's your ego right now? I don't really care. Like, all of this stuff is aura, whatever, okay? Yeah, aura farming. Except the real problem here is, regardless of all the PR, I don't think
His clip channel cut that out, by the way. Nice.
am making an impact in places, in avenues where it matters. I don't think I'm able to penetrate broader consciousness.
He can't penetrate. He could, but the reason why he doesn't is just because he's too scared to actually go to any of these places. I mean, like, it's very obvious. It's very simple. Like, he's too afraid to go to challenging platforms. So, of course, when you just sit in a hug box and preach to the choir, you're only ever going to have people that all agree with you. Like, yeah, I mean, what are you going to...
Amongst the youth, and I think that that's what matters. And I still think that Americans are deeply selfish in their examination of foreign policy. And yeah, I don't know. I think I think people are just collectively getting dumber and dumber and more racist by the minute and by the day. And I constantly feel sad about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dude, how's your ego right now? I don't really care. Like, all this stuff is aura, whatever.
What is he upset about? I feel like he came off so many good media appearances recently. How could he be upset? So he's lied about the timeline, lied about the reason for being pulled, lied about the policies, lied about the rights being violated, and gets to reap all the benefits of it and make everyone believe his First Amendment was violated. I mean, you shouldn't really even be obsessed with Hasan. Like, we know that he's a subhuman fuck. You should be upset with the how lazy the coverage was from all of the media people. That's like the real crime. But Hasan just seems my claim that he's mentally weak. Oh, okay. What is this?
Hello! And now it's not just a terrible segment. This Friday night, Ben After Dark returns. Why hello? And
Ben
now it's not
After
just
Dark.
a terrible segment. It's a full-blown disaster.
It is great to be here, Ben.
That's right. We took a perfectly short, manageable late-night bit, and we turned it into a full-length show. I'm sure it is. Why? Because no one asked us to, and that felt like the right reason. Which makes sense. Now, exclusively for Daily Wire Plus members, Ben After Dark delivers more of everything. More uncensored takes.
Oh my God, that's rough.
More cultural chaos, unvetted questions from celebrities who should know better, and more segments that probably should not exist. I know, we have a professional writing staff. This week, we ask Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee if he knows about Bill Belichick's new girlfriend.
And everybody else is glaring at her, not Bill Belichick.
And someone let a mystery guest ask me whatever was on their mind, totally unfiltered. So nothing
Totally
about
unfiltered.
Declaration of Independence or the Territorial Incorporation Doctrine. Oh, and there's a brand new Ben Destroys, because it's either this or I start throwing things at my TV. There are 330 million people, and that was the best we came up with. It's the all-new, definitively worse, absolutely more Ben After Dark. Friday night only at DailyWirePlus.com. Only for members. You're welcome.
You're welcome, he says. Okay. U.S. was downgraded by Moody's ratings on an increase in government debt, a landmark move that casts doubt on the nation's status as the world's highest quality sovereign borrower. Have we ever been downgraded before?
Did you see Sam talk to Ezra Klein today? Yes, I did.
Sam
he had
owned him.
a long interview with Ezra that, wow, seemingly went on for an entire hour, as a matter of fact, almost an hour, where this is a different Klein, not the Klein that all of you drama perverts are thinking of. This is Mr. Abundance. He's also wanted to come on my stream as well. The thing is, like, I don't know enough about abundance. It started off as an interview, and then I think it turned into more of a debate because of the differences in opinion between Sam Cedar and Ezra. I will give you the full rundown. Ezra is a full-on piece of shit. Okay,
Jesus.
That seems a little bit aggressive. He is a full-on piece of shit.
Oh, Hasan wants to be in the good graces of the libs. Well, I feel like a lot of the progressives are attacking Ezra, though. It's funny that Hasan would hate Ezra Klein because Ezra Klein he's like the Pete Buttigieg tier. Yeah.
I think he's just a liberal, man. Goddamn. I will give you the full rundown. Chatter wants Bobby's news, but also doesn't want to get deported to El Salvador. Yeah, my hate for liberals is pure. Yeah. Sam was saying he could have gone another hour. Oh, I can see it. Full rundown. I hate him. Really mad. Abundance is neoliberalism with a new coat of paint. That's what it sounds like from everything that I have seen, all the bits and pieces that I've seen of the book. But like I said, I haven't read it. I have not read it. So I don't know. I don't know enough. I don't have an opinion on it. Other than a lot of annoying people have defended it. But I have a little bit of a soft spot for this E-Klein, I will admit. So who knows?
Why?
I think he is 100% a liberal. I disagree with his worldview, but having said that, I do think that he is genuine. Not that it makes all that much of a difference. Listen, I want to build housing, but it won't happen by turning our cities over to tech bros and private developers. Our clients are kryptonite or something. No, I mean, I like Ezra Klein.
You were on the Iglesias' show, I guess the Slow Boring podcast. I mentioned that we had responded, so we wanted to have you on to talk about the book. We had Paul Glasses on from Washington Monthly, your old haunt.
Oh, right, yes, love Paul.
With a critique that was, I think, like a middling critique. Some of the proposals that were brought up in the book. But let's just start with you outlining, like, thematically, what is the book about?
The book is about a very simple question, which is, what do we need more of and how do we get it? And then the parts of the book that I think have aroused more controversy, critique, energy, conversation, is that much of the book is exploring the question of why in the places Democrats govern, or in the times when Democrats govern, are liberals, are Democrats, are in some cases people on the left, unable to produce more of the things we need. Why is there so little housing in California and New York? Sam, where are you? Just so I have you
in New York.
You're in New York. So why in places like New York and California and Illinois, where you have a lot of Democratic control, have become very affordable? Why is it very hard to cite enough clean energy, even though that's become a major project for the Democratic Party? Why is so much that we do so goddamn slow? Medicare released its Medicare cards a year after it was passed into law. Getting prescription drug prices negotiated on 10 drugs took 3 years and will only go into effect this year, just in time for Donald Trump to take advantage of it and brag that it was him who did it. So this question of the sclerosis of liberal government, how do we actually make it deliver the things it is promising to deliver, is the core inquiry of the book.
And the culprits run across, I guess, like four sort of main silos, as far as I can tell. Like we have the regulation and bureaucratic red tape, and this is a problem both in terms of like building infrastructure and to some extent within the context of housing. There are that housing is also addressed by like local, I guess, incumbent groups that have power there. The infrastructure, again, some of that bureaucratic process is a function, and we'll get into this, is a function of environmental regulations that end up getting abused in some fashion.
Okay, he's probably going to re-listen to a lot of this. I'm going to re-listen to a lot of this. What is this story? Hospital tells family brain-dead Georgia woman must carry fetus to birth because of abortion ban. Holy based. An actual breeding machine. A pregnant woman in Georgia who was declared brain dead after a medical emergency has been on life support for 3 months to let the fetus grow enough to be delivered. A move her family says a hospital plan was required under the state's strict anti-abortion law. With her due date still more than 3 months away, it could be one of the longest such pregnancies. Her family is upset that Georgia's law that restricts abortion once cardiac activity is detected doesn't allow relatives to abstain whether a pregnant woman is kept on life support. Georgia's so-called heartbeat law is among the most restrictive, is among the restrictive abortion statutes that have been put in place in many conservative states since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade 3 years ago. Damn. Jesus. Morpai was almost kidnapped today walking back to her car on stream.
I'm happy with that.
Take you out to dinner?
No thanks.
I knew you wouldn't recognize me as your phone.
What?
I know you're not lying out here.
Huh?
Okay, if that's all you want.
Bro, what the fuck? Bro, what the fuck? That was real. That was not a joke, bro. Did you see that? Did you see that? Hold on.
It's kind of spooky. Someone just tried to kidnap me at Iron Forge in the parking lot, not visible in a clip, but he did try to get at me, said, that's how you want to play it, and tried to get at me. What the fuck? That was her tweet about it.
Find any evidence of that on the internet, but it seems like he's very comfortable speaking for what's offensive to Jews and what isn't.
That's why it seems like he's joking.
It
like,
does
so
seem
weird.
like he's like joking, like
can't find any evidence of that on the internet, but it seems like he's very comfortable speaking for what's offensive to Jews and what
That's
isn't.
why it seems like he's joking.
It
like,
does
it's so
seem like
weird.
he's like
Can't find any
joking,
evidence of
Can't
what?
find any evidence of that on the internet, but it seems like he's very comfortable speaking for what's offensive to Jews.
Are they referring to like evidence of people being anti-Semitic or whatever? Is that what they're...
At 10 a.m. Eastern, here on C-SPAN 3.
I took the whole middle of the week off because I wanted to focus on filming a video. I'm happy to report that I got done what I wanted to do. We filmed it. It came out good. It's just a matter, I'm going to edit it up. A few other things need to coincide. And then, my friends, let's just say, well, you remember how what happened after the first nuke in World War II?
There was a second nuke.
That's right. There was a second nuke. These things come in pairs, Dan.
Gotcha.
You hear that?
But it's not like branded as another nuke,
Say
right?
what?
Like the type of video or the title, is it? And
No, it's not.
It's not.
It's not. It's just metaphorically. It could be. That'd be maybe a fun way to label it. The second nuke has dropped. Yeah, it's good. It's good. You guys are nobody knows what the fuck is coming. It's gonna be so fantastic, you guys. I'm giddy with excitement.
Hamas says Witkoff promised them that if they released the American hostage, Trump would get Israel to end the blockade of Gaza. That's fucking hilarious. Instead, Israel has been escalating attacks. It's hilarious that Hamas thought it could trust Trump. Senior Hamas official told Drop Site that the group received a direct commitment from Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, that 2 days after the release of U.S. citizen and Israeli soldier Eden Alexander, the Trump administration would compel Israel to lift the Gaza blockade and allow humanitarian aid under the territory. Witkoff, quoting the official, also promised that Trump would make a public call for an immediate ceasefire. Trump did fuck all. What is this? Video to trigger chat.
Real quick before I start, I will never send you an email, and definitely not from a Gmail address. Please don't get scammed by whoever is doing this.
Okay.
Last year, I wrote an article for the Globe and Mail detailing why renting a home is not always a bad financial decision, despite the common perception that it is. That article received hundreds of comments from readers, many of them exemplary of what people get wrong about the rent versus own decision for housing. People tend to assume that homes are great investments. They're not. That mortgages are a wealth-building hack. They help, but not as much as people think. That paying off a mortgage lowers your housing costs. It actually raises them. And that owning a home makes people happy. It might, but don't count.
Paying off a mortgage lowers your housing costs. It raises them. How could that possibly be true? I'm so curious for number 3. It has to be something more sophisticated than just the writing off the interest, right? There's got to be. I'm super curious with that.
Count on it. I'm Ben Felix, Chief Investment Officer at PWL Capital, and I'm going to tell you what people get wrong about the rent versus own decision for housing. One of the worst ways to make the rent versus own decision is comparing the monthly cost of a mortgage payment to the monthly cost of rent. A mortgage payment is not the cost of living in a home. I hope that will become clear as we proceed through the video. Homes are generally terrible investments, yet a lot of people believe that they could not have found a better investment. One reason is salience bias, the tendency to focus on information that stands out, whether due to its prominence, emotional impact, or vividness, often at the expense of other less noticeable or less emotionally charged details. Buying a home is a big emotionally charged purchase, and the final price is likely the result of emotional negotiations with a seller. The same goes for selling a home. This leads people to focus on those two numbers, how much they bought the home for and how much they sold it for. If you bought a home for $40,000 in 1974, did some upsizing, and eventually sold for $2 million in 2024, you would probably feel pretty good about the decision. But there are two big problems with this evaluation. One is that compounding is hard to think about. 50 years is a long time. The compound average growth rate to get from $40,000 to $2 million over this period is 8.2%. Don't get me wrong, that is a great return. This example does come from Vancouver after all, and from a comment on the internet from an anonymous person arguing that owning a home is great. I did find an example of a home in Vancouver that listed for $51,900 in 1974 and sold for $1.65 million in 2024. That lowers the compound growth rate to 7.16%. Still great, but here's some context. Over that period, the MSCI World Index, an index representing the global stock market, returned 10.2% annualized in Canadian dollars, and the TSX, an index representing the Canadian stock market, returned 9.44%. Clearly, homes are not the only way to compound wealth, even in a market like Vancouver. It is important to reiterate that Vancouver is an extreme example. The returns to housing in Canada and around the world are generally lower. The price return on housing Canada-wide from 1974 through 2024 was 6% before inflation, and inflation ran at 3.76% annualized over that period, meaning a real housing return of a little over 2%. Data from around the world going as far back as 1870 show inflation-adjusted returns to owned homes as a little over 1 percentage point on average, while stocks have outpaced inflation by about 5 percentage points. The economic reality is that homeowners bear the cost of having their money invested in a lower expected return home rather than higher expected return stocks. This is called an opportunity cost. To be conservative, I think 3% is a reasonable figure to use as the opportunity cost of having money invested in a home rather than in stocks. The other issue is that the salience bias hides the total costs of owning a home. If you buy a house for $51,900 and then sell it for $1.65 million many years later, your return on that asset is not the 7.16% compound growth rate. The reason is simple. Owning a home costs a lot of money. Between regular maintenance spending to keep the house running, spending to make up for depreciation of the building like the roof deteriorating, renovation spending to improve and update the home, which many people do, and property taxes, it's not uncommon for people to spend 2 to 3% of the home value per year on average just to live there. A good example is that 1974 listing that I found. It was completely rebuilt in 2012 before selling for $1.65 million in 2024. The rundown 1974 structure would be unlikely to have sold for the same price. Homes are depreciating assets. People get really upset when I say that, but it's true. Land appreciates. Homes, buildings degrade and decline until in many cases being torn down and rebuilt. Those depreciation, maintenance, and renovation costs need to be included in the calculation of the return on the home. People that disagree with that 2 to 3% per year number have probably never owned a home. But I didn't just make that number up either. Academic research and data from Statistics Canada support figures in that range. I'll link sources in the episode description. For one example, in National Accounts data, Statistics Canada reports average maintenance and repair costs of 0.81% as a proportion of net residential housing stock over the last 50 years, and renovation spending of 2.35%. This implies that there is more than a 3% average annual contribution to the average increases in home values that can be attributed to costs incurred by homeowners. Even if we take the lower end, 2%, removing that from 7.16% results in a return of 5.16% for this Vancouver home. There are, of course, costs to invest in stocks too, but they're typically much lower than 2 to 3% per year as long as you're not investing in the highest fee actively managed mutual funds or segregated funds. Renters do also need to cover their housing costs since you can't live in your tax-free savings account. The interesting thing here is that when you add up all the costs of living in an owned home, the ongoing maintenance, appreciation, renovation costs, property taxes, and the opportunity cost of investing in a home rather than stocks, you typically end up with a number pretty close to what you would pay in rent. Take 2% in estimated ongoing costs and a 3% opportunity cost for having money in a home rather than in stocks. That is 5%. With these numbers, theoretically, rent should cost around 5% of the value of a home. If either renting or owning were materially more expensive overall, it would be reasonable to expect people to shift between the two options until their costs converge. If rent is cheap, more people will switch to renting, up until the point where rent stops being cheap. The interesting thing is that this ends up being a pretty good model for rents in Canada. The national average price for buying an apartment in Canada in March 2025 was $512,300. Multiplied by 5% and divided by 12 to get a monthly number, we get $2,134 as the implicit cost of owning the average apartment in Canada. The national average rent for apartments is $2,119, almost identical to what my simple model here predicts. This means that in this example, you are approximately financially indifferent between renting and owning the average apartment in Canada. The math doesn't always work out like this, but this thinking lets you gauge whether owning or renting is relatively cheap or expensive. For a long-term perspective, including the effects of mortgage debt, which I'll come back to shortly, you can use the free rent versus own calculator on PWL Capital's website to see that long-term wealth outcomes in this case are comparable. I'll link this example preloaded with these values in the video description so that you can play with it. I used national average data here, but you can plug in numbers for your specific city to compare projected outcomes. In some cases, rent might look cheap, and in some cases, it might look expensive. I should say a few words about how this model works. It is comparing the long-term outcome of buying a home to the counterfactual outcome of renting. In the first year of the model, the owner buys a home. They pay a down payment and closing costs. The renter instead invests the down payment and closing costs in a portfolio of stocks and then pays rent, which increases 1% per year above inflation in the model. The total cash flow cost of owning...
Please stop saying this. I hate this topic. I'm sure maybe this will be addressed, but would rental payments not just go into a black hole rather than buying a house where it is still an investment? It's not going into a black hole. You're paying to have a place to live, which is where a lot of the money that you pay for a house goes into. It's why you pay to deal with the depreciation of the house, to replace the roof or replace the AC or make repairs, whatever. You're paying for a place to live.
A home, including property taxes, maintenance costs, and mortgage payments, are assumed to be the total cash flows available to both the renter and owner. If rent costs less than the owner's cash flow costs, the renter is saving and investing the difference into a portfolio of stocks. If rent costs more than the cash flow costs of owning, a common scenario with the mortgage paid off, the renter funds the cash flow shortfall from their portfolio. This scenario assumes that the renter is investing in their RSP, TFSA, and FHSA, which are not taxable, but I will come back to the implications of taxable investing later. To come back to the main points on home ownership not being such a great investment, salience bias leads people to focus on what they bought their home for and what they sold for, ignoring the ongoing costs of living in the home, and especially at long horizons, overestimating the compound returns on their home. Properly accounted for, the returns to housing are typically not special, and similar financial outcomes can be achieved by renting and...
I still can't wrap my mind around how an asset that appreciates so much in value results in money lost. I don't know if the asset itself necessarily is appreciating a ton in value, or if it's not just the land that's appreciating, and then you're paying upkeep costs on the house, because you have to pay, there's huge maintenance fees that you pay on owning a home, whether it's time in repairs or like maintaining the lawn or whatever else, or whether it's actual money in terms of like massive repairs like HVAC stuff or roofs or windows or whatever else.
Investing in stocks. There are multiple academic studies based on Canadian and US data showing this to be true. Let's move on to the value of mortgage debt. I'll come back to forced savings and tax treatment later. Mortgage financing is one of the most favorable...
Why would a landlord rent out a place at a lower rate of their costs? They won't. Landlords typically make money on... They should make money. They should cover the cost and make a little bit of money. You're paying a premium to the landlord.
forms of financing available to most people. It is generally low cost and does not get called when the home value drops, like a margin loan for stocks can. Borrowing early in life to get exposure to assets is arguably a good thing, and mortgage debt is a great way to do that. It's also a double-edged sword. Many people in Canada were squeezed financially when mortgage rates increased after the pandemic, and they can be a burden if your property value declines and you want to move. The main point I want to make here, though, is that a mortgage is not a silver bullet for owners to build more wealth than renters. Take an example where a home is bought in cash by a homeowner. The counterfactual renter invests the cost of buying the home, in this case the full price of the home plus closing costs, in stocks, and then pays rent. The owner doesn't have a mortgage, but they do still have some costs like maintenance costs and property tax, but their cash flow costs are much lower than the renters, meaning the renter in the model has to draw from their portfolio to cover the difference. The thing is, the expected returns on the renter's investment portfolio are more than enough to make up for the difference. The owner is paying a large implicit cost by having so much home equity relative to the renter's large stock portfolio. After 50 years, the renter's wealth exceeds the owner's by $2.2 million. Next, consider the same case, but instead of paying in cash, the owner puts down a 20% down payment and finances the remainder of the purchase with a mortgage. Now, the owner has large cash flow costs because in addition to property taxes and maintenance, they have a mortgage payment. The renter initially invests the smaller down payment into a stock portfolio and then saves the monthly difference between the owner's higher ongoing cash flow costs and their rent into an investment portfolio. The net worth difference after 50 years in this case is $467,000. Financing with a mortgage was more financially advantageous for the owner than paying cash, but the renter was still able to come out ahead without borrowing any money. The owner's relatively high cash flow costs allowed the renter to save more into their higher expected return portfolio, all else equal. The next misunderstanding I want to cover is that people who own homes are wealthy because they own homes. It is true that the average net worth of a homeowner is significantly higher than that of a renter, both in Canada and the United States. But this is not because owning a home is an automatic path to wealth. Renters tend to be younger, have lower incomes, and spend more of their incomes on housing costs, making building wealth by any means more of a challenge. Buying a home would not solve these problems, and some research shows that homeownership could actually negatively impact the happiness of low-income households due to the financial burden of homeownership. A 2017 paper, A Revision of the American Dream of Homeownership, seeks to answer the question of why owner households tend to be wealthier than renters. The authors find that it can be attributed to choices within the scope of the individual, like how much the renter saves, rather than through the impact of exogenous market variables like housing or stock market returns. They show that households that fail to reinvest the cash flow difference between renting and owning accumulate less wealth, and importantly, they find that property appreciation plays only a minor role in the results for homeowner and renter wealth differentials. This analysis shows, as I've already said, that renting and owning can theoretically have similar financial outcomes, but this requires renters to save and invest the cash flow cost difference between renting and owning. In some cases, this is simply not possible due to limited financial resources, which is why a lot of people rent. A problem owning a home rather than renting would not solve. Whether renters with sufficient cash flow available to save will actually be disciplined savers is a valid concern, and I will come back to that later. Next is one of the most misunderstood aspects of homeownership, that a paid-for home reduces your housing costs. This seems like it has to be right on the surface because once your mortgage payment is gone, your cash flow costs are much lower. You still have some ongoing costs like property taxes and maintenance, but mortgage payments tend to be the largest cash flow cost for owners, making owning feel cheaper than renting once the mortgage is gone. The problem here is mental accounting bias, separating cash flow and capital into separate mental accounts. When both capital and cash flow are considered, the reality is that paying off a mortgage actually increases housing costs, because for most people, the opportunity cost of having home equity rather than other investments exceeds the cost of borrowing money from the bank. We saw this play out in the earlier example of paying cash for a home. To be clear, there are lots of benefits to having a paid-for home. It reduces risk, reduces cash flow costs, which do matter for people who are cash flow constrained, and it feels great. But a paid-off home is counterintuitively more expensive to live in than a mortgage-financed home due to the large opportunity cost of home equity. The opportunity cost is smaller or even negative in some cases for people who would alternatively be invested in very conservative assets like guaranteed investment certificates or cash. The last misconception I want to cover is that homeowners are happier than renters. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but in another video I reviewed multiple academic papers showing that owning a home is unlikely to increase your life satisfaction, and if it does, it probably won't increase it as much as you expect. In some cases, owning a home may even decrease happiness by soaking up your active leisure time with home maintenance tasks and saddling you with a big pile of debt. As a former renter and current homeowner, I can tell you that the psychological weight of owning a home rather than renting is significant. I think it's important for people to understand those misconceptions, but there are definitely distinct benefits to owning a home. In Canada, increases in the value of your primary residence are not taxed. We do have tax-sheltered investment accounts that allow investments like stocks and bonds to grow tax-free, but their contribution room is limited. For someone who's filled up all of their registered savings accounts and is investing their savings in a taxable account, the opportunity cost of home equity is a lot lower because the after-tax rate of return on counterfactual investments is lower. Revisiting the example from earlier that showed the renter coming out ahead in the long run, making their investments taxable puts them at a disadvantage relative to the owner, and that disadvantage gets larger with an increasing tax rate. An important note here is that this does not mean that owning is always better than renting for taxable investors with high incomes, but it does mean that the equilibrium rent, the rent that makes renting and owning financially comparable, is lower. Instead of $2,119, this renter would need to find a place for $1,700 to have a financially comparable outcome to an owner. This is a good argument for buying a home in some cases. Taxable investors with high incomes who want large and more expensive homes may be better off owning. Probably the strongest argument for owning is that owned homes, especially without a mortgage, hedge the costs of living in a specific home. A hedge means that it increases in value when housing costs increase and decreases in value when they decrease. This is very useful to you if you want to stay in a specific home for a long time. Rising housing costs in an area could result in renters being priced out and having to move, and being unable to afford buying a home in that area. Owners are protected because they already own the home. Rising housing costs and home values don't really affect them. They're hedged. To be clear, a hedge can cut both ways. More recently in Canada, we have seen falling rents and home prices. An owner who never wants to move is unaffected by falling prices, but an owner who decides to relocate may have to absorb a loss in the value of their property. The other thing to keep in mind is that it can be hard to find certain types of rentals. I bought a house in the forest during the pandemic after renting for my whole adult life because I could not find a rental in the forest. Finally, possibly one of the biggest benefits of owning a home is behavioral. A mortgage on an owned home is a powerful commitment device. It forces savings. And a home is a lot harder to panic sell in a down market than a portfolio of stocks.
I think the behavior is the largest thing, is that if you have a house, it's harder to just like cash it out and sell parts of it. Whereas if you have stocks or whatever, you can just sell if you're being done or whatever. Yeah.
When I model long-term outcomes for renters and owners, I typically assume that the renter is saving all of the difference in cash flow costs between renting and owning. If they're not doing that, the financial comparability of renting and owning falls apart quickly. This means that financially successful renting requires extreme discipline to match the wealth of owning. Most people won't skip a mortgage payment, but they might defer contributing to their RSP. Discipline extends to investing too. It is well known that investors tend to trail the returns of the assets they invest in due to behavioral errors, like buying high and selling low. These points are extremely important, and honestly, they make me think that most people should probably buy a home if they can afford to. To be clear, the nerds watching my channel are not most people. Disciplined and informed renters can have good financial outcomes. Many of the common arguments in favor of homeownership are wrong. Homes are not great investments. Homeownership is not the causal factor in making people wealthy. Wealthier people can afford to own homes. Mortgages are not a wealth hack. Having a mortgage-free home does not reduce your housing costs, and homeowners are not happier than renters. This does not mean that renting a home is superior to owning, but it does mean that renting deserves more credit than most people are willing to give it. That said, there are cases where owning a home makes sense. Favorable tax treatment, the ability to hedge the cost of living in a specific home, the lack of availability of certain types of housing for rent, and behavioral benefits can all be important. In the long run, a disciplined renter who matches their rental cost to the total cost of owning a home saves the cash flow cost difference between renting and owning into higher expected return investments like stocks, and doesn't make costly behavioral errors with their investments, can expect to accumulate comparable wealth to a homeowner. Thanks for watching. I'm Ben Felix, Chief Investment Officer at PWL Capital. Tell me what you think people get wrong about the rent versus own decision.
Wow, thanks, buddy. Okay. Damn, this is going to be slow. We might listen to this. Apparently, the, what's the name of the solicitor? John Sauer? Apparently he gets cooked in this.
Here on C-SPAN 3. In the meantime, we bring you a live simulcast of our Washington Journal call-in program, previewing today's oral argument.
This is Washington Journal. For those of you who are watching on C-SPAN 3, welcome. We are simulcasting now on that network as well, because coming up at 10 a.m. C-SPAN will take you to our typical gavel-to-gavel coverage of the House, but we will remain with you here on C-SPAN 3 and take you to the Supreme Court for those oral arguments about birthright citizenship. We're also outside.
Can you explain the point about a mortgage-free home being more expensive? Can you just put the extra cash on it? Well, just because generally mortgages are available at lower interest rates than you would get if you would just invest the money. So if your home was paid off, you'd be better off getting a mortgage on a bigger home, moving into there, and then investing the difference, basically. But
side of the Supreme Court, and we have our colleague Tammy Thuringer talking to some folks standing out there.
Hi, Mimi. There are still people waiting in line. They did let some people in about an hour ago. They only let 5 people into the line. They're now waiting to see if they're going to allow any more in or if that will be it for today. 2 people who have been in line for a very long time, Caitlin and Tal. Thank you for being with us. Caitlin, tell us, you live here in D.C., what you do, and your interest in being out here today.
Sure. So I work in transportation research and policy, so it's not very tied to today's case, but I've been tracking a lot of other litigation and court cases that do relate to the realm that I'm in. But because of that work and that tracking, I've just gotten more interested in the courts and the work that they do, and I actually live in the neighborhood, so I figured I should take advantage of that while I can and come out and see if I can't get in, and this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime sort of opportunity.
And I'm a student at Georgetown Law here in the district, and I'm studying to do civil rights impact litigation. So this case is really important. Birthright citizenship is crucial to the United States as a country. We're one of the only countries to do so, and immigrants make this country and make this country beautiful. And so I'm here for the civil rights aspect of it. And as a law student, I also think nationwide injunctions are really important for curbing excessive administrative and executive power, which we're seeing from the current administration.
And we are keeping our fingers crossed for you. We're hoping that somebody's going to walk down and give you tickets to get inside still. If you were to get in there, what are your expectations? What were you hoping to see?
Honestly, I've never been in the building, so anything is going to be great. But I'm really excited to see the justices and hear the oral arguments and just really feel the atmosphere. I feel like it's going to be really surreal to be in a building that old with that much history, knowing the cases that have gone there before and the decisions that have been made. So I'm just really looking forward to being a part of history and hearing the case.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of my professors is arguing today, so I'd be excited to see her. I've seen her argue at the court before. Also, one of my professors writes a lot about nationwide injunctions. Both are at Georgetown Law, so I'm excited to see that come to fruition. Also, you know, it's interesting to be back and see cases in person. We listen to a lot of cases live online, but it's different when you go in person. I think also this is a historic moment and a big moment where the court continues to either establish legitimacy or questions its legitimacy based on how it rules here. And so being there for a historic moment that hopefully can expand rights to people and continue the rights that have existed for a long time is really, really important to me.
You work in law, but not immigration. You are a law student. What are your expectations for the case? Having reading a little bit about it, do you think that the justices will rule one way or the other?
Well, I'm pretty, aside from law, I work in transportation. I've just been tracking cases, so I'm kind of a layperson, I feel like, very much a member of the public, but I do hope that they do not uphold this executive order. I don't think it'll be unanimous. My boyfriend and I disagree on this, but I don't think it'll be quite unanimous, but I don't think it makes sense for it to continue as is. I just think practically speaking, it won't make sense, and I don't think that it is who we are as a nation.
I think the court has participated in a lot of unprecedented rolling back of civil rights that really matter to a lot of marginalized folks in this country. So I'm not confident with what they will do here. I hope that they will follow the law and follow what's right and follow what America's built on and uphold birthright citizenship and uphold the importance of nationwide injunctions. But I don't have confidence in the court as a body.
And you, along with others in this line who've been here for a very long time, have bonded after spending overnight on the sidewalk here outside the Supreme Court. Tell us what time you got here and your thoughts on the Supreme Court using a lottery system to get people in this year.
So we got here right before 9.
These are oral arguments for the, these are for the birthright citizenship case. Wait, this isn't the one where the guy gets super cooked then, huh? Wasn't the cooked one having to do with the, oh, fuck. I think Justice Kagan was asking questions to the government, something to do with like, do you guys follow court order? It is? This is, okay. Oof. And then apparently Amy Coney Barrett stepped in. Okay, never mind. It is
9 p.m. last night, which was a bit of a surprise for us. We actually thought we would roll in around midnight. We grabbed a pizza last night and thought, oh, we should just swing by, see if there's anybody there. And when we came by, there was already a pretty good line. So we hustled right on over and set up camp.
Hold on, we got picture.
We will hear argument this morning in case 24A884, Trump versus CASA Incorporated, and the consolidated cases. General Sauer.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please...
Wait, quick name.
Oh my God! What the fuck was that? Oh my God! What the fuck was that?
Apparently he got banned. I don't know if he got banned. That was the title of the thread. Rip.
The court. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump issued Executive Order 14160, protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. This order reflects the original meaning of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to the children of former slaves, not to illegal aliens or temporary visitors. Multiple district courts promptly issued nationwide or universal injunctions blocking this order, and a cascade of such universal injunctions followed. Since January 20th, district courts have now issued 40 universal injunctions.
So John Sauer is arguing on behalf of the government. I believe the Solicitor General is the lead debate bro when the government has to fight in the Supreme Court for whatever crazy shit they want to do. I think it's generally the Solicitor General is the one who takes on those debates. I don't know if the Solicitor General does anything else besides debate in the Supreme Court. Okay, I think this is explicitly and specifically his job, his big area of responsibility. Okay.
Injunctions against the federal government, including 35 from the same 5 judicial districts. This is a bipartisan problem that has now spanned the last 5 presidential administrations. Universal injunctions exceed the judicial power granted in Article 3, which exists only to address the injury to the complaining party. They transgress the traditional bounds of equitable authority, and they create a host of practical problems. Such injunctions prevent the percolation of novel and difficult legal questions. They encourage rampant forum shopping. They require judges to make rushed, high-stakes, low-information decisions. They circumvent Rule 23 by offering all the benefits but none of the burdens of class certification. They operate asymmetrically, forcing the government to win everywhere while the plaintiffs can win anywhere.
They invert the ordinary hierarchy of appellate review. They create the ongoing risk of conflicting judgments. They increase the pressures on this court's emergency docket. They create what Justice Powell described as repeated and essentially head-on emergency in action.
Is he talking about TROs, or is he just talking about injunctions in general, universal injunctions? Okay, all right.
They operate asymmetrically, forcing the government to win everywhere while the plaintiffs can win anywhere. They invert the ordinary hierarchy of appellate review. They create the ongoing risk of conflicting judgments. They increase the pressures on this court's emergency docket. They create what Justice Powell described as repeated and essentially head-on confrontations between the life-tenured and representative branches of government. And they disrupt the Constitution's careful balancing of the separation of powers. I welcome the court's questions.
General Sauer, these universal injunctions, as you say, have proliferated over the last 3 decades or so. Would you discuss, though, the origins of universal injunctions? In particular, I'm interested in sort of historical analogs or the historical pedigree, particularly the Bill of Peace that was proffered by respondents.
Yes, Justice Thomas, as you, I think, first pointed out in your separate opinion in Trump against Hawaii, the Bill of Peace is something very distinct from a universal injunction. So the Bill of Peace involved a resolution of a small, discrete set of claims of a small, discrete group, and even more fundamentally, it was binding on the members of that class and those represented by the class. So it's much more analogous to a modern class action under Rule 23. And in fact, as we've argued in other cases and as this court has described in opinions like Ortiz, the Bill of Peace evolved into and is directly developed into, so to speak, the modern class action that has all the same features of a Bill of Peace. So in the words of Chief Judge Sutton in the Sixth Circuit, the Bill of Peace, it was a domesticated animal that looks nothing like the dragon of a universal injunction.
I'm sorry. Here,
go ahead.
Here, there's a discrete identified group on one issue. Does citizenship mean are you born in the territory of the United States, or does it mean are you loyal to someone else, which is your claim, or are your parents loyal to someone else? So that's no different than what happened in a Bill of Peace. The United States is bigger, so it extends more broadly, but it's still an identifiable group on a discrete, singular question.
Your Honor, I'd say 3 things in response to that. First of all, our primary contention is that the citizenship clause related to the children of former slaves, not to illegal aliens who weren't even present as a discrete class at that time. But more fundamentally here, as to the issue of the Bill of Peace, there are critical differences. The Bill of Peace was a binding judgment that would bind absent class members. Here we have the asymmetry.
Well, here class actions don't bind anyone who opts out. So class actions are not like bills of peace.
I would think that a Rule 23b2 class action, which would be the relevant analog here, would be one that would be binding on absent class members and would not have the same notice and opt-out procedures. And more fundamentally, that sort of argument that there's a commonality here among...
Let's say birthright citizenship is revoked. Does this mean the Trump admin can deem certain child births as illegal births? I have no idea what that would look like. So, like, say, for instance, birthright citizenship is revoked. Let's say both my parents had birthright citizenship, and then I was born in the U.S. Would I lose my citizenship as because that's not considered birthright, right? It's considered, I don't even know what the name of it is, lineage or whatever. That's a different type. Would I lose that, or would people lose? I have no idea. This is just an insane, stupid thing to try to fight. This is just so stupid. This is a waste of everybody's time. This is ridiculously stupid.
Opt-out procedures. And more fundamentally, that sort of argument that there's a commonality here among, all the people who purport to be affected by this is the sort of argument that's made in class certification.
So can I ask you a question? Your theory here is arguing that Article 3 and principles of equity both prohibit federal courts from issuing universal injunctions. Do I have your argument correct?
We argue both of those. And
you argue both of those?
Yeah.
If that's true, that means even the Supreme Court doesn't have that power.
The Supreme Court would have the authority to issue binding precedent nationwide, but as
we couldn't enforce it against universally, is your argument.
If there was a decision.
I don't even know what that means. The authority to issue binding precedent, but no injunctions? Because an injunction, I believe, is what what compels the behavior. An injunction is something that tells you that you have to not do something or have to do a particular thing, I believe, right? So I don't know what that means.
Decision that violated the
and I think that's why Sotomayor responded, so we can have binding precedent, but we can't enforce it anywhere, everywhere? Like,
universally, is your argument.
If there was a decision that violated the precedent of the court, then the affected plaintiffs could get a separate judgment.
And
so
that
means
is what this you're talking about the hundreds and...
I feel like these are meme arguments. Could get a separate judgment? What is that? If there was a decision that violated the precedent of the court, then the affected plaintiffs could get a separate judgment. Oh, so he's arguing that you could never get a proactive, you could never get an injunction ever. If somebody did something bad, you would just get a judgment every single time the government violated or was violative of somebody or their rights or whatever. You could never punish the government for doing something. They could only lose, I guess, because judgments are always civil in matters. Well, not that maybe this matters. I don't know. This is retarded. It's stupid. He's saying the executive could violate the laws endlessly until each individual sued on their own behalf. Correct. Well, not until each individual sued on their own behalf. Or yeah, for that individual, but then they could just keep violating the laws over and over again, and you would just have to sue the government over and over again. This just sounds retarded as fuck, but...
Thousands of people who weren't part of the judgment of the court, they would all have to file individual actions?
Not necessarily. There
or a class action.
A class action would be the way
that makes no sense whatsoever.
Respectfully, we believe that.
Well, what was the purpose of the Bill of Peace if not to settle a legal question finally? And if even the Supreme Court doesn't have that right and must invite hundreds of thousands of lawsuits, what are we buying into?
Yeah, what the fuck is the point of this?
If a set of claims satisfies the rigorous criteria of Rule 23, Rule 23 is the modern analog of a Bill of Peace. We have something very different here.
No, we don't, because the argument here is that the president is violating an established, not just one, but by my count, 4 established Supreme Court precedents. We have the one ARC case where we said fealty to a foreign sovereign doesn't defeat your entitlement, your parents' fealty to a foreign sovereign doesn't defeat your entitlement to citizenship as a child. We have another case where we said that even if your parents are here illegally, if you're born here, you're a citizen. We have yet another case that says even if your parents came here and were stopped at the border, but you were born in our territory, you're still a citizen. And we have another case that says even if your parents secured citizenship illegally, you're still a citizen. So as far as I see it, this order violates 4 Supreme Court precedents.
Yeah,
and you are claiming that not just the Supreme Court, that both the Supreme Court and no lower court can stop an executive from universally from violating that holding, those holdings by this court.
We are not claiming that because we're conceding that there could be an inappropriate case.
Only a class, only by a
class. Can I hear the rest of his answer?
A Rule 23 class action. And then the more fundamental point as to all those Supreme Court decisions you referred to.
So what do we do temporarily?
Temporarily, the court may issue, the lower courts may issue injunctions that remediate the injuries to the plaintiffs that appear before them. Lower courts in appropriate cases may certify class action.
This sounds so, unless I'm misunderstanding it, this just sounds so fucking retarded on its face. This is just like on its face like a retard argument, right? Like, so let's say that the government, what would it even be? I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say the government interprets it that the IRS in taxing you there's like a phrase that comes out of a TV show called "Let's tax that ass," and it means that you get to fuck somebody in the ass. You send an IRS agent to go fuck somebody, and the government interprets it and has that rule. And let's say the government starts sending IRS agents to go fuck people in the ass. Then let's say somebody says, "Well, hold on, this is bullshit," and then they take the government to court. When they win that case, the courts can't enjoin the government's behavior and say, "Hey, by the way, there's an injunction against you. You can't go fuck people in the ass anymore." The government's saying, no, every single ass-fucked person has to come to court and win a case that says we're not going to fuck them in the ass anymore, but we can also still keep fucking everybody else in the ass, but every single affected person. Now, maybe they can do a class action or a mass tort, but every single person has to continually take this to court because we don't do injunctions anymore. We don't do universal injunctions. This is like on its face. It's just like the dumbest argument I've ever heard in my life. Unless there's something else that I'm not understanding about this. It just sounds on its face like so fucking stupid that a court can't issue an injunction anymore. I don't get it.
To the plaintiffs that appear before them, lower courts in appropriate cases may certify class action.
So when a new president orders that because there's so much gun violence going on in the country, and he comes in and he says, I have the right to take away the guns from everyone.
Oh my God, yes! She's not using a rape example, which fine. Okay, I get it. But yeah, so they're going to come. So every single person now has to, you can't enjoin the government from that behavior, and every single person has to go and, like, this is so stupid.
Then people, and he sends out the military to seize everyone's guns. We and the courts have to sit back and wait until every named plaintiff gets, or every plaintiff whose gun is taken comes into court.
In appropriate cases, courts have certified class actions on an emergency basis. We found at least 4 cases in recent years where that was done. But more fundamentally, we profoundly disagree with the characterization of the merits. This is now fully briefed in the Ninth Circuit in case number 25-807, where we describe how that characterization of the holding of Wong Kim Ark and the other decisions is profoundly incorrect. And
you
that
still
is
have counsel. Could I ask you about a different type of case that has broader impact than on the particular claimant? Like a claimant who's alleging that the districting in a particular case has resulted in racial discrimination against him or her based on how the district is drawn. Now, a judicial decision about that one plaintiff would implicate the redistricting throughout the whole case, so throughout the whole state. How does your theory address that situation?
That would be what you might call an indivisible remedy, where what the court is doing there by, for example, redrawing the district lines is, as this court said in Gill against Whitford, the only way to remediate the injury of voting in an unconstitutionally drawn district. That is similar to abatement of a public nuisance or, for example, in the school desegregation cases, where remediating the injury to the plaintiff before the court necessarily has collateral consequences to many others. And certain environmental cases might have a similar thing. For example, you stop the local plant from pouring, water pollution into the water. That benefits the plaintiff. It happens to benefit a bunch of other people. Now, that's very different than what we have in these universal injunctions, where it is a divisible remedy. I mean, I point to the holding of the District of Massachusetts in this case, looking at the individual plaintiffs. That court said, well, obviously, I don't have to give a universal injunction to protect individuals other than the individual plaintiffs. They are given complete relief by an injunction that tells federal officials only to treat their children as citizens.
Why? I guess the question is why does the law require that? I mean, I appreciate that a court could, in a divisible remedy kind of case, narrow in to the plaintiff, but you seem to be suggesting that Article 3 or Rule 23 or something requires that. And I guess I don't really understand it.
If I may offer 2 responses to that. In the Article 3 context, that is the principle announced in Worth against Selden, announced in Gill against Whitford, and Lewis against Casey, where this court has said again and again, what we do in the Article 3 context is grant remedies that are tailored to remove the injury to the complaining plaintiff. Sometimes they have even very broad collateral consequences, but in the Article 3 context, what the court has not done, and every time it's focused on this in National Treasuries Union, Employees Union, in the
But I guess I don't see why then the divisible remedies or indivisible remedies is an argument. I mean, if Article 3 is suggesting that the court has to focus in on the plaintiff only, then it would seem to me that that would be the power requirement across the board. I thought Article 3 was really about limiting the court's power with respect to jurisdiction, that we say the court has to determine whether or not there's subject matter jurisdiction over the issue and whether or not there's personal jurisdiction over the defendant. And once you have those things, the court can evaluate
Like subject matter jurisdiction means that the court has there's that they would have there's a law that is within the jurisdiction of that particular court. So, for instance, if something is illegal in Arizona but it's not illegal in New York, and somebody wants to sue you in New York over it, well, you would say, well, New York, you don't have subject matter jurisdiction here because this isn't illegal in New York. And then personal jurisdiction means that the lawsuit has to involve people. I think both parties have to have some kind of nexus within that particular state. So, for instance, let's say in New York it's illegal to flip somebody off, and you've got two people that live in Arizona, and somebody wants to sue you in New York over your behavior in Arizona. The court would have subject matter jurisdiction, but both people would lack personal jurisdiction, I believe, to have their case heard in that court. I believe there are different types of jurisdiction and all that, whatever.
Merits of the legal issue and issue, especially in equity, appropriate relief. Now, I appreciate that there are some prudential concerns that the court considers, but it seems to me that in many, many, many circumstances, we have not required the court to limit their relief to the particular plaintiff as a matter of constitutional Article 3 requirement.
I disagree with that. I'd offer a response, both first as to Article 3 and then as to the scope of equitable authority. In the Article 3 context, this court said in Worth against Selden, for example, that the Article 3 judicial power exists only to redress the injury to the complaining parties. Again, in Gill against Whitford and Lewis against Casey.
All right, so let me give you a hypothetical. So suppose we have a manufacturing plant that unlawfully releases environmental toxins into the air, and we have a plaintiff who lives near the plant, brings a nuisance lawsuit and says they're being harmed by unlawful release.
I'm seeing what you're saying, Toothless, but that it can't be that stupid. Toothless with a law flare in chat says they're arguing that it violates the case and controversy Article 3 jurisdiction because relief to non-parties is not part of the case or controversy. So they're saying that because the relief implied by a injunction or universal injunction affects people that aren't part of the case necessarily, that relief is unconstitutional. So in my IRS ass fucking example, they would say you can't provide that injunction because you're providing relief of all of these potential taxpayers getting fucked in the ass. You can't provide that relief because they're not parties to the case. It can't be that stupid. Is it? I mean, it could be because this government has argued more ridiculous stuff, but
hypothetical. So suppose we have a manufacturing plant that unlawfully releases environmental toxins into the air, and we have a plaintiff who lives near the plant, brings a nuisance lawsuit and says they're being harmed by unlawful release. Your argument suggests that the judgment for the plaintiff has to narrow in on preventing, to the extent possible, preventing harm to the plaintiff. But it seems to me that that's not necessarily the case. You suggest with the Chief Justice in response to him that there can be incidental beneficiaries, that the court could say no more toxins if it's unlawful for the defendant to do that, correct?
Yes, we do.
So why, if your Article 3 principle is correct?
Because, again, the Article 3 principle is remedying the injury to the plaintiff, or set of plaintiffs, could be many, who are before the court. Right. That has collateral consequences.
Counsel,
that could help.
Let me ask you on that point, would one distinction be who's bound by the judgment? Like, I'm wondering whether if the plaintiff needs, you can only, I think Judge Strauss said in the Eighth Circuit when addressing this issue, you can't peel off part of a nuisance, so the whole thing has to be shut down. Could a neighbor sue affirmatively to hold the nuisance maker in contempt if he started to begin again the nuisance?
That's a great point. It would not be.
So what they're saying here is, so a guy is dumping toxic waste into a river. One person sues to get that person to stop doing it. Now there just happens to be another person who benefits from the person to stop doing it. And then if he continues, or if he goes ahead and he pollutes again, can somebody who wasn't a party to the original case continue the prior case by holding that other person in contempt, basically of violating judgment from another person when they weren't part of the original case. I don't know if that made sense or not.
Bounding on those collaterally.
And again, the nuisance.
That's a great point. It would not be bounding on those collaterally benefited parties, so to speak.
This is if you're listening to this is just a super. This is like all politics. This has nothing to do with the law or any legal interpretation or anything you would. This is just like the most like memified arguments that you could ever possibly have. So what the solicitor is arguing here is he's saying that if I got a judgment from a court saying I'm not allowed to dump toxic sludge into the river, and then like Amy could even use a more ridiculous example. Let's say the person moves from the house and a new person moves in. That person could just go back to polluting because the judgment only applied to the particular plaintiff who was a party to the last case, and nobody else there could be considered like a primary benefactor or a primary relationship to the original judgment. So every new homeowner would have to sue them again and again and again and again and again and again. Or if the homeowner died or was removed or whatever, and a neighbor was like, "Hey, you were polluting our water. Can you please go back to doing that?" It's like, wait, I'm sorry, you don't have a judgment against me. I don't have to do shit. This is the dumbest. This is a nonsense argument. I can't believe that this is like real. This is just so stupid.
Not be bounding on those collaterally benefited parties, so to speak. I don't want to call them parties because they're not parties before the court. And
they're not benefiting the collaterally. It's not binding, meaning the judgment wouldn't apply to collaterally benefited parties, meaning people that benefited from the prior judgment that weren't parties to the original case. But this is so stupid.
And that, of course, highlights one of the deep problems with the universal.
But why
could you do that
answer, though?
This is so stupid. This is like a meme.
And that, of course, highlights one of the deep problems with the universal.
But why
could you do that?
Answer, though?
Could you do that now for the universal injunction? Could a plaintiff, for example, who has the protection of the universal injunction but was not named in the suit, bring a contempt action of the sort I just described?
They could not do that, but what they could do is run to any of 93 other judicial districts and bring their own lawsuit if...
That's what... Wait. I don't know.
Okay.
No. Under the injunction as it stands, under the injunctions as they stand, could a non-named plaintiff who has the benefit of the universal injunction that's currently in place, could that plaintiff bring a contempt proceeding?
We would...
Or I guess I shouldn't call them a plaintiff. Could that non-party?
We would dispute that they would have the standing to do that because it goes to the heart of...
Well, no. Let's see. Maybe I'm not being clear. Assume the universal injunction is good. Like, drop your argument right now.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
As they currently stand, could someone who is not named in the suit but a beneficiary bring a contempt proceeding?
I think that is what the respondents would certainly contend.
Do you concede that the plaintiffs could bring a Rule 23, like the individual plaintiffs?
I don't know what Rule 23 means. Okay, have to do with class actions. Okay.
We would dispute, we'd have to address the Rule 23 issues, kind of all the criteria as they came up.
But they could seek it. Okay, and then last question.
And they have done that in Western District of Washington. It's just never been briefed because they blasted past
just last question on this point. The states have a different kind of claim for financial harm, and they've pointed out that it would be very difficult to remedy that without some sort of broader relief. I know you contest their standing. I want you to assume that I think they have standing. Why wouldn't they be entitled to an injunction of the scope of the one that has currently been entered?
I would say two reasons. First of all, it's not...
So what is she getting at here? That you could issue an injunction that would apply basically to an entire state, and it would be probably broader than what the government would want to concede here, I'm guessing?
An injunction of the scope of the one that has currently been entered.
I would say two reasons. First of all, it's not necessary to provide complete relief to the plaintiffs. What we offered, for example, in the District of Massachusetts in the First Circuit was an injunction that would enjoin the federal officials and order them to treat the people who would otherwise be covered by the executive order as eligible for the services that result in the pocketbook injuries to the states. And there's really no response to that. That is obviously obviously would fully remediate their injuries and does not require the injunction to be applied in all other 50 states. One state comes in and says, well, people are going to move across state lines. Therefore, we've got 21 states in this case who don't want this relief. Sorry, you've got to impose it on everybody because it has to be offered to this one particular state. So that's one response. The other response is this notion that the states have to be provided a complete relief because of interstate travel and patchwork. I think that's very effectively responded to by Chief Judge Sutton's opinion in the Second Circuit, where he says this is a problem. If we adopt this logic, it justifies a universal injunction in every single case, and that can't be the case. Fifth Circuit's recent DACA decision comes to the same conclusion.
What do you say, though, to the suggestion, General, that in this particular case, those patchwork problems for, frankly, the government, as well as for plaintiffs, justify broader relief?
As to the government, again, Chief Judge Sutton addressed that directly as well when he said that's the federal government's problem. In other words, the federal government, for example, in the First Circuit, we offered that as a narrower scope of injunction, and the decision was, well, that would cause you too many administrative problems. And I think Chief Judge Sutton directly addresses that when he says that's a problem for the executive branch.
That's your problem. All right. Yeah. And then with respect to class certification, your friends on the other side point out that takes time. And there are, as you've emphasized, hurdles that have to be met to achieve class certification. And the argument, of course, is that the injury is immediate and ongoing. And as Justice Sotomayor suggested, might be seriously questioned as to its compliance with this court's precedents. Your thoughts?
I would offer a couple of things in response to that. First of all, there are tools for the courts have tools to achieve sort of class-wide universal relief. I referred earlier that we found 4 recent district court decisions where class-wide relief was given a kind of an emergency basis. However, more fundamentally than that.
And you agree that that's appropriate in certain cases?
It may be appropriate. We do not concede that it's appropriate in this case, but it may be appropriate in other cases. Certainly it's an equitable tool that is consistent with, for example, the grant of equitable authority in the 1789 Judiciary Act, as this court interpreted in the Grupo Mexicano decision, and honestly a line of decisions going all the way back to the early 19th century. So there are tools to address emergency situations, but more fundamentally than that, it is a feature, not a bug, of Article 3 that courts grant relief to the people who sue in front of them. So the notion that relief has to be given to the whole world because others who have not taken the time to sue are not before the court.
I don't like, somebody in DGG chat kind of says, I don't like that when the government shows up, this is all such like esoteric legal bullshit, so nobody gives a fuck, but like, it feels like when the government is showing up to try to argue in favor of being able to do wacky things, they're never actually arguing for the wacky thing itself. They're making these really wacky, goofy procedural arguments to absolutely cripple the court's ability to do anything. Now, maybe they'll get into it more later on, but this case is supposed to be about birthright citizenship, but they're not actually arguing about birthright citizenship yet. Maybe they'll get to that. They're arguing whether or not the courts have the power to issue injunctions. It's just really, really, really weird. And I feel like it betrays the actual motivation here on the government's behalf. They don't really believe that they have legal grounds on any of the shit they're arguing for. They're just trying to cripple other parts of the government. I shouldn't say the government, other parts of the United States, our systems, our constitution or whatever. They're trying to cripple parts of that or chip away at parts of that to allow the government to act in a lawless manner where they can't be held accountable in any reasonable manner.
It's something that results in all these problems.
Last question. Do we need to reach the Article 3 question? Wouldn't it be wise, even if you were to prevail, for the court to reserve that question rather than decide that Congress, for example, could never endow this court with that authority?
That's exactly correct. The court does not have to rest on Article 3 because the court could say, and as we've argued, and as Justice Thomas' separate opinion in Trump against Hawaii says, the 1789 Judiciary Act, when it said suits in equity or what the federal courts can do, we had nothing like this in mind. And then I point to the language in Grupo Mexicano where the court said there what was at issue was a preliminary injunction that froze and likely insolvent debtors' assets so that
there's no way the Supreme Court actually cuts out and gives away power here, right? Well, did somebody say they already released a decision on this today? This was yesterday, right? And today they ruled against this 7-2. We'll guess who the two are. I haven't looked it up, but it's probably Thomas and Alito. I don't know how they did the ruling so fast, or Oh, no, the decision is likely to come sometime next month. Okay, it was a different decision. I was going to say, because I don't think you hear them that quickly after oral arguments usually. So.
An issue was a preliminary injunction that froze a likely insolvent debtor's assets so that the plaintiff could collect at the end of the case. And the court said that's a nuclear weapon in the law, and we're not that had no analog in 1789 in the practices of the Court of Chancery. And if that's a nuclear weapon, I don't know what this is, where repeatedly, 40 times in this administration, we're being enjoined against the entire world.
I'm just going to ask to...
Enjoined against the entire world. Yeah, that's what an injunction is. You just don't like...
You to put yourself in a different frame of mind. Hard to do. Assume something you won't want to assume. But the assumption that I want you to make is that on the merits, which of course you did not take to this court, on the merits you are wrong, that the EO is unlawful. And I want to ask you, if we assume that, how do we get to that result on your view of the rules?
It is very difficult for me to attempt the hypothetical, but I will.
You know, I think that that's the important question in this case. Let's just assume you're dead wrong. How do we get to that result? Does every single person that is affected by this EO have to bring their own suit? Are there alternatives? How long does it take? How do we get to the result that there is a single rule of citizenship that is the rule that we've historically applied rather than the rule that the EO would have us do?
Rule 23 would be one natural path, assuming that a class could be certified, which we might dispute in this particular case.
Well, you might dispute it, and I think the question is.
I don't even know if the class action here, though, would actually do it, because can classes be, I don't know how Rule 23 or class certification works. I don't know anything of this. But like, if you certify a class, can members continue to join the class in the future after a lawsuit is finished? Like, can you continue to have new members joining the class constantly? Because what if you do your class action and you win? Like, let's say you win a class action saying you can't pollute some place, but then all those people leave and new people move in. They don't get to, I imagine they can't join the class that was already ruled on. Like, I don't think class action is an appropriate remedy for something that an injunction would solve. That's what it intuitively feels like to me. But
is there a class that's just all children of people who have entered illegally? Is that an appropriate class? Can the same thing be done under Rule 23? Or are you going to tell me that, no, Rule 23 has lots of requirements, and you'll never be able to certify a class like that?
Yeah, that's what I would
Rule
imagine.
23 provides the equitable tools subject to rigorous criteria, appropriately rigorous criteria, to obtain that kind of class-wide and
That suggests to me you're going to be standing up here in the next case saying that Rule 23 is inapt for this circumstance, with this number of people, maybe with some questions that are individual, who knows. So let's put Rule 23 aside, because I got to tell you that does not fill me with great confidence. How else are we going to get to the right result here, which is on my assumption that the EO is illegal?
That would be a profoundly wrong result, but I think what I would offer is that, very similar to Labrador against Poe, what the court should be engaging here is a balancing of the equitable factors as to the scope of remedial relief, not as to the underlying merits. And our contention that this exceeds the traditional scope of equity that's reflected in the 1789 Judiciary Act, we're overwhelmingly likely to succeed on those merits for all the reasons that are stated in our briefs.
I mean, that's a lot of words, and I don't have an answer for...
Hold on, I'm so sorry. Somebody said, at Destiny, well, the party that the class won against shouldn't be doing the actions that caused the class action suit in the first place, so what would even be the complaint of new members of the class? That's just the thing. If you say you shouldn't even be doing that, that would be issuing an injunction. But they're saying you don't need an injunction, you need a judgment. And what a judgment says is you've harmed particular people, stop harming those people. So if all the people with the judgment leave and there is no injunction, that means that if new parties come and are harmed by the same action, they now have to bring a lawsuit so that they can get a judgment. Because these guys are arguing against injunctions, basically. Not basically, he is. He's arguing against any form of injunction existing that isn't just aimed at one particular party, essentially.
Merits for all the reasons that are stated in our
Yes,
brief.
I mean, that's a lot of words, and I don't have an answer.
Scope of equity underlying merits. And our contention that this exceeds the traditional scope of equity that's reflected in the 1789 Judiciary Act, we're overwhelmingly likely to succeed on those merits for all the reasons that are stated in our brief.
Yes, I mean, that's a lot of words, and I don't have an answer for if one thinks. And, you know, look, there are all kinds of abuses of nationwide injunctions. But I think that the question that this case presents is that if one thinks that it's quite clear that the EO is illegal, how does one get to that result in what time frame on your set of rules without the possibility of a nationwide injunction?
On this case and on many similar cases, the appropriate way to do it is for there to be multiple lower courts considering it, the appropriate percolation that flows to the lower courts, and then ultimately this court decides the merits in a nationwide binding precedent. You have a complete inversion of that through the nationwide injunctions where the district court.
Nationwide binding precedent sounds like you would still have to have every person bringing a case. This is so stupid. This is just stupid.
Also, are you really going to answer Justice Kagan by saying there's no way to do this expeditiously?
Like
appropriate.
The possibility of a nationwide injunction.
On this case and on many similar cases, the appropriate way to do it is for there to be multiple lower courts considering it, the appropriate percolation that flows to the lower courts, and then ultimately this court decides the merits in a nationwide binding precedent. You have a complete inversion of that through the nationwide injunctions where the district
General
courts.
Sauer, are you really going to answer Justice Kagan by saying there's no way to do this expeditiously?
Well, I'll refer to my former answers. Rule 23 provides the tools to do so, multiple injunctions.
But you resisted Justice Kagan when she said, could the individual plaintiffs form a class?
That has never been briefed in the court below. I do not concede that we wouldn't oppose class certification in this particular case. There may be arguments that this case is or is not appropriate for class certification. And
if there were a class appropriate for class certification, you concede that that could resolve the question quickly?
Yes, absolutely.
You concede it could resolve the question quickly through precedent?
Yes, absolutely. It could do so. I mean, we obviously dispute the.
So just on that point.
And if the court, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, please. All right, I got a quick one.
Well, I'm just going to say just on that.
Whoa, how many people are allowed in here? The fuck? That sounded like an audience like 100 people.
All right, I got a quick one.
Well, I'm just going to say just on that point. So, you know, let's say that we're an individual person even. Let's say it wasn't a class. And goes up and gets a ruling from the Second Circuit that the EO is illegal. Does the government commit to not applying its EO in the entire Second Circuit? Or does it say, no, we can continue to apply the rule as to everybody else in the Second Circuit?
I can't say as to this individual case. Generally, our practice is to respect circuit precedent within the circuit, but there are exceptions to that.
What does that even mean? Like, we're going to pick and choose when we want to apply precedent? Like, this doesn't even make sense. Apply precedent. What? This is such a nonsense. This is so stupid. I don't know. Never mind. I'm a retard. I don't know.
Generally your practice, and I'm asking whether it would be your practice in this case.
He's not going to concede anything. He's not going to say because you don't want to bind himself because he's giving. It's like saying. It's like somebody's arguing like I want to go eat at Applebee's and you're like no we're going to eat at McDonald's and you're like oh, fine. Let's say that 5 of us, or then they say like, well, we're not going to go eat at Applebee's because all of you don't want to eat at Applebee's. You'd have to be unified. All 5 of you would have to be unified for us to even consider that. And then you're like, okay, well, hold on. Let's say all 5 of us wanted to go to Applebee's. Would we go then? And they're like, I'm not going to answer that question. It's like, what? So there's nothing. This is all bullshit. Like nothing.
I can't answer because it would depend on what the lower court decision said. So there are circumstances, as I was suggesting, where we think that we want to continue to litigate that in other district courts in the same circuit as well.
Yeah, so that means it's not even the normal time it takes for everything to get up, you know, through the circuit courts and to the Supreme Court. Because even in those circuits that say that the EO is illegal, you're going to be saying, no, you know, we only commit to saying it's illegal to this one guy who brought the suit.
Yeah.
Article 3 and the court's traditional equitable practices provide a range of tools to address that, including a potentially nationwide class action. A nationwide class action,
which you say you're going to oppose when that gets gets challenged.
Yeah.
We are likely to oppose
when that gets proposed.
Yes, and if it does not meet the rigorous criteria of class certification, the court should not enter that injunctive relief.
So then if an EO calling out birthright citizenship wouldn't qualify, there wouldn't be a class certification there for every U.S. citizen that has birthright citizenship. What would? Like, nothing would. These are bullshit answers.
You think, like, how about you're not willing to commit to abiding by the Second Circuit's precedent in my... Suppose that there's a single person who brings a suit, and it gets all the way up to us after 3 or 4 or 5 years. And we say, we really do agree with those 4 precedents that Justice Sotomayor started with, and your EO is illegal. Is that only going to bind the one guy who brought the suit?
No, that would be a nationwide precedent that the government would respect.
So finally, once it gets to us after 4 years, you're going to respect that?
Yes, and in addition, we may well respect circuit-wide precedent. The Second Circuit, it just is...
And for 4 years, there are going to be like an untold number of people who, according to all the law that this court has ever made, ought to be citizens who are not being treated as such.
And in the meantime, any of those plaintiffs could have come forward and sought preliminary injunctive relief, and they could do so on a class-wide basis. There are tools to address this, but the universal injunction, which is issued here 3 days after the executive order was issued, is not one of those tools.
Thank you, counsel. 3 years, 4 years, we've been able to move much more expeditiously. I think we did the TikTok case in a month. Presuming, I gather an important...
Oh, my God. We did the TikTok case in a month? That was, first of all, the ruling on that was so exceptional that they literally spell out in that court case. They're like, listen, we're ruling on this, but this should not be interpreted as having anything to do with any other company or any other thing. And like, this is literally the most narrow ruling of all. You're basically doing like a bench trial on this one particular case. That, like, they literally spell that out in that decision. The idea that that case can be rushed along, or because the TikTok case happened to be rushed along so quickly that that's comparable to a case having to do with like birthright citizenship, or the 50 billion other things that the court would be bothered with if you got rid of injunctions, is so dumb. I don't know.
A month. Presuming, I gather an important part of your answer is that people can litigate differently, and one will go to Massachusetts, the other one will go to Houston, and you'll get conflicting decisions fairly quickly. And is there any reason why this court, and I gather that's your safety net, is that at the end of the day, however long the day is, this court can issue a decision and it will bind everything else. Is there any reason in this particular litigation that we would be unable to act expeditiously?
Absolutely not, Mr. Chief Justice.
Okay, thank you.
What a cuck decision.
Justice Thomas?
General, when were the first universal injunctions used?
We believe that the best reading of that is what you said in Trump against Hawaii, which is that Wirtz in 1963 was really the first universal injunction. There's a dispute about Perkins against Lukens Oil going back to 1940. And, of course, we point to the court's opinion that reversed that universal injunction issued by the D.C. Circuit and said it's profoundly wrong. Now, if you look at the cases that the either party cite, you see a common theme. The cases that we cite, like National Treasury's Employment Union, Perkins against Lukens Oil, Frothingham and Massachusetts against Mellon, going back to Scott against Donald, and all of those are cases where the court considered and addressed the sort of universal, in that case, statewide issue of provision of injunctive relief. So when the court has considered and addressed this, it has consistently said you have to limit the remedy to the plaintiffs who are appearing in court and complaining of that remedy.
So we survived until the 1960s without universal injunctions.
That's exactly correct. And in fact, those were very limited, very rare, even in the 1960s. It really exploded in 2007 in our cert petition in Summers against Earth Island Institute. We pointed out that the Ninth Circuit had started doing this in a whole bunch of cases involving environmental claims.
Justice Alito?
You began by outlining what you see as the practical problems that have been created by universal injunctions. If we were to hold that the states have standing, and if it is possible for a plaintiff to get emergency certification of a class, suppose we agreed with you on universal injunctions, but allowed those other two avenues, would the practical problem be rectified to any substantial degree?
Certainly, if there were an injunction that extended to, all of the litigating states, that would cover a very substantial portion of the country, and also an emergency sort of class certification decision might also grant very broad relief.
So the answer is that the practical problem would not be solved. And if that's the case, what is the point of this argument about universal injunctions?
I think the point is that universal injunctions exceed traditional principles of Article 3, and they exceed the traditional equitable authority. And that's what yields all these sort of pathologies, so to speak.
What's the difference between an injunction and a universal injunction? I don't know if a universal injunction, I don't know if that's a real legal thing. Like, I think injunctions definitionally, I think, are usually universal, right? Like, if you're enjoined from a particular behavior, what they're saying is an injunction, it sounds like what the government is trying to argue is that an injunction can only apply to a party to the case. So, for instance, let's say that there is a company that's polluting in a river, and a homeowner wants to take this company to court to enjoin the behavior, to get an injunction against the behavior. It sounds like what they're saying is, if you were to get an injunction against this defendant, the injunction would only apply to the defendant's behavior towards you. So, like, if you moved and another person in a house, had them pollute in the exact same manner, they would say, well, you weren't a party to the original case. You have to sue them as well to get a judgment that might provide for an injunction. But it's only to an individual. You can't have these injunctions where you're a party that loses a case is enjoined from a behavior that affects people that are outside of the scope of the original lawsuit, which is that's my understanding of what's being argued, but that's just kind of cringe, I think. But
of the current practice of issuing them very, very easily.
Thank you.
Justice Sotomayor?
You answered Justice Gorsuch, I think correctly, that if Article 3 precludes universal injunctions, then even class actions are illegal. That's what you're arguing, isn't it?
I disagree with that profoundly.
How could it, if Article 3 and only prohibits injunctions that affect non-members or non-plaintiffs, how could Congress give a remedy like a class action?
In an article or in a Rule 23 class, every represented member of the class has standing by hypothesis. So every single one of them has an Article 3 injury, and Rule 23 again.
So that would be the only method.
It would be very similar to the Bill of Peace, where all those parties, either present in a representative capacity, are bound.
We can act quickly. If we are worried about those thousands of children who are going to be born without citizenship papers that could render them stateless in some places because some of their parents' homes don't recognize children of their nationals unless those children are born in their countries. They're not going to be receiving federal benefits because that's the claim of the plaintiffs here, that the state plaintiffs, that they're not going to be able to provide services to those children. Shouldn't we grant cert before judgment on that issue? If we're afraid that this is, or even have a thought that this is unlawful executive action, that it is Congress who decides citizenship, not the executive, if we believe, some of us were to believe that, why should we permit those countless others to be subject to what we think is an unlawful executive action? As unlawful as an executive taking the guns away from every citizen.
Cert before judgment would be another tool, but through which this court could act expeditiously.
Is this the kind of case where the equities would call for that? And why wouldn't it? It's a pure legal question. What does the Constitution mean with respect to citizenship? There are no individual facts that would alter our conclusion. If we can't do it by a universal injunction, because you say Article 3 doesn't permit that, Article 3 wouldn't permit us to give a universal injunction even if we rule, why don't we grant cert before judgment so that all of these parents would have a firm Supreme Court decision that they can...
I think, I don't know. I don't remember. I'm not like a lawyer or anything, okay? So I think what she's saying is, couldn't the court in this case, if the court had decided that this was something that applied to everybody and it seemed obvious that that was the case, and it's like a massive impact on all these people, that if the court were to decide this, then right before they make a ruling on a particular case, they would just grant a class certification immediately before they make the ruling. So you'd have an individual plaintiff bring a case, the court rules in a way, and then the court sees like, okay, well, obviously this affects all citizens. So right before making the ruling, they're just going to grant class certification so that it would apply to everybody, which seems to short circuit this whole argument. I think that's what she's saying here.
Have a firm Supreme Court decision that they can take where? Because you're saying nobody can grant a universal injunction.
No party has asked for that in this case, and I think one reason is that would deny the court of the benefit of percolation in multiple lower courts of a novel and sensitive and important constitutional question.
We have novel courts who've percolated this issue and said you're violating precedent. Not only precedent, but the plain meaning of the 14th of the Constitution.
Respectfully, I think what we have are lower courts making snap judgments on the merits that ignore the fundamental principle of the 14th Amendment, that it was about giving citizenship to the children of slaves, not to the children of illegal immigrants who really were not even a very discrete class at that time. And that's the sort of argument that deserves percolation.
Congress who argued against the 13th Amendment just because of that. Some people who argued against passing the amendment just because of that, because it would give citizenship to gypsies.
I think the relevant history of the 14th Amendment is the statements of Senator Trumbull, who emphasized that domicile was the key criterion. He said that.
Then it should be in there. Remember, we only look at stuff like this when the text is not clear and unambiguous. If the text is clear and unambiguous, which I'm pretty sure for the 14th Amendment it is, then that's it. Then you stop there. You don't get to go back and try to reinterpret, like, well, what did they mean at the time, or what did they want to do that wasn't in the text? That's only if you have an ambiguous or unclear reading. Like, this is just,
that in a letter to Andrew Jackson, and we've cited in our Ninth Circuit briefing a host of decisions that back that up.
Rejected repeatedly. We can go into the history of citizenship, but I still go back to my question. You claim that there is absolutely no constitutional way to stop, put this aside, to stop a president from an unconstitutional act, a clearly, indisputably unconstitutional act, taking every gun from every citizen. We couldn't stop that.
I disagree with that for the reasons I've said, including the equitable tools.
No, because you said to us we'd have to wait until there was a final judgment. You're not sure you would respect the judgment of every circuit. You're not sure that you would respect even a final judgment of the Supreme Court, because it only binds the parties before it.
Yes.
And if there's no class action, that only binds the parties before the court.
I don't think there's a, so to speak, really, really unconstitutional exception to the strictures of Article 3 or the scope of equitable authority, and the court should not recognize one, because what we see, not just in this case, but in the 39 others, is that the district courts who are issued these injunctions all passionately disagree with the thing that's being challenged in that. So that principle that, well, this we think is really unconstitutional, therefore we should ignore the general principles of Article 3 is not a principle the court ought to adopt.
Justice Kagan?
So, General, on this question of expedition, I mean, it sort of depends on the government's own actions in a case like this one, where one can expect that there is not going to be a great deal of disagreement among the lower courts. I mean, let's assume that you lose in the lower courts pretty uniformly, as you have been losing on this issue, and that you never take this question to us. I mean, I noticed that you didn't take the substantive question to us. You only took the nationwide injunction question to us. I mean, why would you take the substantive question to us? you're losing a bunch of cases, this guy over here, this woman over here, they'll have to be treated as citizens, but nobody else will. Why would you ever take this case to us?
Well, in this particular case, we have deliberately not presented the merits to this court on the question of the scope of remedies, because, of course, that makes it a clean vehicle where the court doesn't have to look at the past.
You're ignoring the import of my question. I'm suggesting that in a case in which the government is losing constantly, there's nobody else who's going to appeal, they're winning, it's up to you to decide whether to take this case to us. If I were in your shoes, there is no way I'd approach the Supreme Court with this case.
Oh, because what she's saying is, let's say the government was losing on these cases, then once the lower court has made its decision. Oh, right, because if the lower court made, because he's basically saying we need like a Supreme Court decision here to say whether or not we're going to have binding precedent on how we act across every person in the entire country affected by this. But what she's saying is, okay, well, let's say that you're losing all these cases in the lower courts. You just would never appeal it up to the Supreme Court, right? Why would you ever appeal these up to the Supreme Court and risk losing the ability to do your action that you're avoiding being challenged on, which is, yeah.
So you just keep on losing in the lower courts.
And who cares?
And what's supposed to happen to prevent that?
Nothing.
Again, I respectfully disagree with that forecast of the merits, but in response to the question, what I would say is we have an adversarial system, and if the government is not, for example, not respecting circuit precedent on the court's hypothetical in the Second Circuit, someone injured in the Second Circuit could take the case up, and they could say, look, the government is violating circuit precedent on the hypothetical multiple circuits.
That's the case we're going to take? Somebody who says, after we've said that this all has to be done one by one, then we're going to take a case from somebody who objects to proceeding one by one?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I understood the hypothetical.
If you win this challenge and say there is no nationwide injunction and it all has to be through individual cases, then I can't see how an individual who is not, being treated equivalently to the individual who brought the case would have any ability to bring the substantive question to us.
They would bring a lawsuit in the federal district courts against the government for an injunction protecting them. And if the government wasn't respecting, on the hypothetical circuit
and then they win.
And then they win, and then you just stop. And it never goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't have original jurisdiction on these, so there's never a Supreme Court case.
And if the government wasn't respecting, on the hypothetical circuit
and then they win. And again, you need somebody to lose. But nobody's going to lose in this case. It's just you're going to have,
every single individual person who's adversely affected is supposed to bring a case against the government in federal court over and over and over and over.
Individual by individual by individual, and all of those individuals are going to win, and the ones who can't afford to go to court, they're the ones who are going to lose.
The tools that are provided to address hypotheticals like this, again,
This is not a hypothetical. This is happening out there, right? Every court has ruled against you.
We've only had snap judgments on the merits. Obviously, we're fully briefing the merits in the courts of appeals, and our arguments are compelling. More fundamentally, in response to the question.
I'm suggesting to you, the real brunt of my question is, in a case like this, the government has no incentive to bring this case to the Supreme Court because it's not really losing anything. It's losing a lot of individual cases which still allow it to enforce its EO against the vast majority of people to whom it applies.
And again, Rule 23 provides an avenue to address those very concerns.
Thank you.
Justice Gorsuch?
Well, Justice Kagan asked my questions better than I could have. How do you suggest we reach this case on the merits expeditiously?
There's a number of tools the court could do that. We think this case is one that cries out for percolation, that the court should allow the lower courts to address the merits issue multiple times. It's currently on briefing in 3 different cases in the First, Fourth, and Ninth Circuits, and we think that that's the appropriate way to do it. If the court disagreed, obviously,
when you lose one of those, do you intend to seek cert?
If we lose, yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Justice Kavanaugh?
So the technical problem here seems to be class-wide relief without the district courts going through the steps to assess whether a class should be certified, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And if you win here on this procedural point, it seems very likely that the day after, there are going to be suits filed all over the place seeking class-wide treatment, maybe statewide classes, circuit-wide classes, maybe nationwide classes. I'm sure they're being prepared now. Right? And on what basis would you oppose a statewide class?
I could imagine certain bases, and again, we haven't briefed this in the lower courts yet.
You've been promising everyone here.
Is he not going to?
That Rule 23 is the cure-all.
You keep saying Rule 23, which has to do with certifying a class. Certifying a class is when you have a whole bunch of plaintiffs and say that they are entitled to the exact same relief, they have more or less the same case, and that they're going to be treated as one collective body in an action, a party against, in this case, the government. He keeps saying Rule 23, the class certification, is what's going to, that's the appropriate remedy, not these universal injunctions as applied to individual plaintiffs bringing cases. But then it sounds like he's saying, but if you guys were to fight for a class certification, we would obviously oppose that and we would fight against it.
Promising everyone here that Rule 23 is the cure-all, and I want to explore on what basis you would oppose a statewide class. Just take that one for now.
For example, and again, this is very hypothetical because I'm not predicting that we will or will not oppose that. We haven't taken a position on that yet.
If you were to oppose it, on what basis would you plausibly oppose it?
There may be problems of commonality and typicality, for example. For example, there's two different sets of groups that are affected by the executive order. There are those where the mothers are temporarily present and those where the mother are illegally present. And in both cases, the father is neither a citizen nor a lawful permanent resident. So there might be issues of typicality. Adequacy of representation might very well be an issue. So there would have to be that rigorous application of those criteria. Now, the argument may be this is a case that is a natural candidate for a Rule 23b2 certification. That may well be true. The government hasn't taken a position on that. Our position is not that class certification will necessarily be granted. Our position is that Rule 23 is how these sorts of claims should be channeled.
And you think, I think you just said, it's very possible that class certification may be granted.
It is possible. We don't know yet because there was a class certification motion filed at the very beginning in the Western District of Washington, and it was just never briefed because obviously the pathology here is that the nationwide injunctions just go blowing past the class certification procedures.
And I guess Rule 23b2, for a lot of the cases we've had over the past 25 years that you talk about where there have been universal injunctions or where the lower courts have had that, 23b2 could have been used in a lot of those, presumably, correct? Eviction moratorium, student loans, OSHA vaccine mandate. Do you see the possibility that 23b2 could have been used instead of, some of those were APA, but put aside the APA issue for now?
Yeah, we do set aside that issue, if I may.
I got it.
But yes, I agree with that as to some, but not of the other cases. It's hard to see how, for example, Biden against Nebraska, where a state was the plaintiff, might have been a 23b2 class. And the Alabama Association of Realtors might have been a much better candidate for that. And again, not taking a position on the individual merits, our overarching point is there's a tradition of equity in this country that goes back to the English Court of Chancery, and what's happening in these universal injunctions, again, 40 times in this administration, at least 22 times in the last administration, 64 times in the administration before that, is just disregarding those appropriate procedures to seek this kind of global relief.
I want to ask one thing about something in your brief. You said, quote, and of course this court's decisions constitute controlling precedent throughout the nation. If this court were to hold a challenged statute or policy unconstitutional, the government could not successfully enforce it against anyone, party or not, in light of stare decisis, end quote. You agree with that?
Yes, we do.
If you prevail here, the original executive order had a 30-day period before it took effect. If you prevail here, should there be any pause so that things can happen that need to happen for 30 days or some period of time, or should we not even worry about that?
Yes, we can see that the 30-day ramp-up period that the executive order itself calls for never started because the universal TROs were entered almost immediately, and we don't dispute that there should be a 30-day
universal
ramp-up
TROs.
period. For another reason as well, which is that we've been enjoined from even doing guidance, even formulating a policy, and that itself is another problem with these injunctions.
On the day after it goes into effect, this is just a very practical question, how this is going to work. What do hospitals do with a newborn? What do states do with a newborn.
I don't think they do anything different. What the executive order says in Section 2 is that federal officials do not accept documents that have the wrong designation of citizenship from people who are subject to the executive order.
How are they going to know that?
The states can continue to, the federal officials will have to figure that out.
How?
So you could imagine a number of ways that the federal...
What the fuck? Hello? Sorry,
They got to know that.
The states can continue to, the federal officials will have to figure that out.
How?
So you could imagine a number of ways that the federal officials could...
Such as
they could require a showing of, documentation showing legal presence in the country. For a temporary visitor, for example, they could see whether they're on a B-1 visa, which would exclude kind of the birthright citizenship in that context.
For all the newborns? Is that how that's going to work?
Again, we don't know because the agencies were never given the opportunity to formulate the guidance. They had 30
They're only
days.
going to have 30 days to do this. You think they can get it together in time?
Again, and I know this has just been turned completely on its head because it's Trump and whatever the fuck else, but you're supposed to have the answer to these questions figured out beforehand. You don't do massive, sweeping, unhinged policy, and then after you do it and you get challenged, be like, this is illegal. Be like, well, hold on. Like, we didn't even get a chance to do it. It's like, well, how are you going to do it? Well, I don't know. We were going to figure that out. No, excuse me. What do you mean you were going to figure that out? No, like you either have figured out how to do this ahead of time before you start enacting these EOs or before you start offering these policy, guidances to your departments. You figure that out beforehand. You don't just do it and then see what the fuck happens and then, soy the fuck out when people are challenging you in court and go, oh, we didn't even have time to see how it would play out. How was it going to play out? Well, I don't know. We were going to see.
Your Honor, that's what the executive order instructs them to do, and hopefully they will do so. Again, it's a speculative and hypothetical scenario because they were enjoined from even starting that process.
And then last question. You mentioned before this has come up in the last 4 or 5 administrations primarily. I guess I've thought about that a lot too. Why? It seems why might be it's harder to get legislation through Congress, particularly with the filibuster rule. Presidents want to get things done with good intentions. The
Has the Supreme Court ruled on this yet? No, this was an oral argument from yesterday, so no.
Branches that work for those presidents push hard to, when they can't get new authority, to stretch or use existing authority, and they've been pushing, understandably, all with good intentions, all the presidents, both parties, right, with good intentions, pushing. Is that your understanding of why this has happened more, that there's less ability to get legislation? Because I'm trying to figure out the why to your opening about the last 4 or 5 administrations. I agree with it. I think that might be the why, but I'm curious what you think.
I'm speculating about the motivations of the individual district judges who grant these, but one explanation might be this is an extraordinary power. It's a very strong power for the reasons the questions have reflected.
Well,
for a district
let me
judge
just pause you right there. The underlying point is that these district judges are not just doing universal injunctions. They're finding these actions illegal because they're exceeding existing authority, and oftentimes we are too, when it gets to us, finding the actions of presidents of both parties unlawful because they exceed existing authority. So is that coming up more often why is that coming up more often?
It's hard to do an historical analysis, but I would draw an analogy to the New Deal. And Professor Bray makes this point in his article that actually there were very, very passionate challenges to sort of nationwide policies during the Roosevelt administration, and they were not addressed by issuing universal injunctions. He cites an example where in one case a policy had been held illegal and there were like 1,600 injunctions against that policy, all protecting the individual plaintiffs. So if you look at the history, it's not clear that what we have of disagreement, but difficulty, gridlock, getting things through Congress and so forth, that's not necessarily new. What is new and is certainly unique to the last 5 presidential administrations is having these given on this widespread basis and this systematic basis, 40 again in the last 4 months.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
General Sauer, I want to ask you about a potential tension. Well, no, not potential tension, an actual tension that I see in answers that you gave to Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Kagan. You resisted Justice Kagan when she asked you whether the government would obey within the Second Circuit a precedent. I'm distinguishing between opinions and judgments here. Did I understand you correctly to tell Justice Kagan that the government wanted to reserve its right to maybe not follow a Second Circuit precedent, say, in New York, because you might disagree with the opinion?
Our general practice is to respect those precedents. But
what? How do you say something like this? The answer is no. You can't say that. You just can't have a generality here. If you're saying sometimes you respect precedent and sometimes you don't, then that means that you're not appealing to the court's rationale. You're appealing to your own rationale. And the answer is you're never following precedent. Even when you are following precedent, you're not following precedent. You're just doing what you think is right in your opinion. There might be times where that aligns with precedent. And in that case, you would say outwardly, well, look, I'm following precedent, but you're not really. You're just doing what you think you have the authority to do. And then when you're not following precedent, it's not that you're not following precedent. It's that you are just doing what you think you ought to be doing, right? You can't, this is not an answer that you can ever say is generally true or generally not true. You either are or you aren't. And when you are following it, it just happens to be coincidental. That's it.
our general practice is to respect those precedents, but there are circumstances when it is not a categorical practice. It is, and that is not
this administration's practice or the longstanding practice of the federal government. And I'm not talking about in the Fourth Circuit, are you going to respect a Second Circuit? I'm talking about within the Second Circuit. And can you say, is that this administration's practice or a longstanding one?
As I understand it, longstanding policy of the Department of Justice. Yes, that we generally, as it was phrased to me, generally respect circuit precedent, but not necessarily in every case. And some examples might be a situation where we're litigating to try and get that circuit precedent overruled and so forth.
Well, okay, so I'm not talking
litigating to get something overruled. In my mind, is not saying that you're not following precedent. You can fight against it if you want, for sure. But insofar as you lose that fight, then you follow it. You would always follow whatever the law is, essentially.
About a situation in which, the Second Circuit has a case from 1955 and you think it's time for it to be challenged. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in this kind of situation. I'm talking about this week, the Second Circuit holds that the executive order is unconstitutional, and then what do you do the next day or the next week?
Generally, we follow those.
So you're still saying generally.
Why does he keep saying that? We don't...
Yes.
And you still think that it's generally the policy, longstanding policy of the federal government to take that approach?
That is my understanding.
Okay, but it sounds to me like you accept a Cooper versus Aaron kind of situation for the Supreme Court, but not for, say, the Second Circuit. Like where you would respect the opinions and the judgments of the Supreme Court, and you're saying you would respect the judgment, but not necessarily the opinion of a lower court.
And again, I think in the vast majority of instances, our practice has been to respect the opinion as well.
In the vast majority.
Well, in the circuits as well, but my understanding is that has not been a categorical practice in the way respect for the precedents and the judgments of the Supreme Court has been.
So you're not hedging at all with respect to the precedent of this court?
That is correct. I believe the quotation from our application directly addresses that, and we stand by that completely.
Okay. Next question. So this is also a follow-up to some of the questions that others have asked you about the merits of the order not being before us. Did I understand your answer to be because you think percolation is really important for this one?
We do think percolation is really important for this one, but the reason the merits are not before is because we've only submitted a stay application on the scope of relief question, and as Labrador against Poe indicates, the scope of relief is a separate question for the merits.
I understand it's a separate question, but there are plenty of times that the government comes to us and asks for both.
Absolutely. For example, recently in the Wilkins and Cox application, we did exactly that.
And the reason why you didn't ask for both here is because you think that the merits question needs percolation.
Yes, but also more fundamentally, it illustrates that the very problem with these nationwide injunctions is they force this rushed, fast and furious decisions on the merits. So I think it would be very inappropriate in this case to come to a stay application saying, please give us a rushed, decision on the merits of something that's very
But the government's done that in other cases too, right?
Those cases would be different. In this case, the example I gave earlier, we think it's very clear cut on the merits. This one is we concede a novel and sensitive
So this one
question.
Isn't clear cut on the merits.
This one, in this case, we want the court to address the remedial issue. If we offer the merit first, that's a vehicle problem because the court has, in many cases,
address the remedial issue, as in make it so the court can't issue injunctions anymore.
Just address the merits and not the remedial issue. And it's imperative from the federal government's perspective that the remedial question be addressed.
Okay, so last question is about why that is. Justice Alito asked you, well, what's the point of this? If the same thing could happen, which is effectively the EO being enjoined everywhere via class action or because it's necessary to provide complete relief, say, to the states, is there any difference in your view between, say, a class is certified of all individual plaintiffs and they win, and the executive order class-wide, there's a judgment saying that it can't be enforced. Do you want to say, follow up, is there any practical distinction you see? Why does the government care? Is it just the rigors of the certification process, or is it something more?
The rigors of the certification process. Keep in mind that in many of these cases, we successfully oppose class action.
Let's assume I think you can't successfully oppose it here for individual plaintiffs.
Well, I mean, that opportunity to have our day in court on that is very, very important.
I understand, but let's assume, go with my assumption.
Assuming that we were to lose
assume the class is certified. Is there any benefit? If a class is certified, and let's say, you were pointing out that the executive order targets two different kinds of people. Let's assume that it's commonality because, they only target one portion of the order, right? In that circumstance, does the government get anything different? This is back to Justice Alito's question about what's it to you? What's the practical difference to you? Do you want to say anything about whether there's a practical difference between a universal injunction and a loss in the class?
Absolutely. Okay. Among many others, the represented class members.
So that she's asking, so let's say that they provide an injunction, okay, saying that you can no longer do a particular behavior. He's saying that's not fair. You can't have injunctions because these people aren't even part of a case, so that's bullshit. But she's saying, okay, well, you're saying so that remedy is not fair. However, you're arguing that if you lose, when you say lose that class cert, what is happening is if somebody's arguing for a class action lawsuit, they have to make that argument proactively to the court saying this is why these people should win class certification. And the defendant would likely argue with saying, no, they don't get class certification. Fuck that. They have to either bring these cases individually because they don't qualify as a certified class, and then you would go back and forth on your Rule 26 arguments here. So she's saying, well, let's say you lose the class cert argument. They do get class certification, and then you lose the case and a judgment is issued against you. Why is it that remedy doesn't violate Article 3, or that remedy is okay, but the injunction remedy is not okay, is the question I think that's being asked here.
Absolutely. Okay. Among many others, the represented class members are bound in the class action context. And that means that if they lose, they're bound by that as well. So they're taking a grave risk, so to speak, by proceeding through a class action. And it has this symmetry where the government is bound if we lose, they are bound if we don't lose. And that's a very, very important distinction.
And you would respect that judgment?
If it were a judgment. Now we may try to litigate in other contexts to try and get a different judgment from a different district court, but we would be bound by that judgment, as would they. And that's the crucial point.
Okay. Justice Jackson?
So as far as I can tell, your bottom line seems to be that what you call universal injunctions give relief to non-parties without going through the necessary steps, which you identify in Rule 23. Do I have that right? I mean, is that sort of like boiled to bare essence what you're saying?
I would say there's a lot more to it, but that's one very important point.
That's a key point that I want to focus in on for a moment. I guess I don't understand why you are saying that these kinds of injunctions are giving relief to non-parties. First of all, I think they can be also easily characterized as focusing only on the defendant pursuant to the court's jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction over this person relative to the subject matter jurisdiction that the court has, and the relief is telling the defendant, stop doing this thing that the court has found to be unlawful. So rather than characterizing it as a quote-unquote universal injunction, I think one could easily see that this is just about the extent to which the court can constrain a defendant over whom it has personal jurisdiction. Can it do so completely or just partially with respect to, just say stop with respect to this plaintiff? Am I I don't understand where this idea of universal injunctions comes from in this context.
I think the relevant distinction is an order. That orders, in this case, the government defendant to cease allegedly unlawful activity as to the parties who have come into court and sued, and one that says to the government defendant, cease the allegedly lawful activity against everyone in the entire world.
No, just cease it. Just stop. This thing, this executive order, we do this in the APA context all the time, right? The statute says you hold that you set aside the conduct, right? That it's unlawful. And we don't really parse it out and say, okay, but it's unlawful only
as it applies to this person or that person. It's just unlawful conduct, period. It doesn't really matter who it affects. It's just it's unlawful conduct.
As it applies to the plaintiff or not. So it's a very common concept for the court to enjoin a defendant from doing particular unlawful behavior. And what you're now asking us to do is to require that the court have an additional limitation in its order that says you only have to stop doing this with respect to the plaintiff. And that's the part that I don't understand. I guess
APA is Administrative Procedures Act, and she's saying that like for like an APA challenge, you would stop the behavior, period, because it would be a bad thing as so far as it doesn't comport with the procedures that you're allowed to do, I think. But you would never make that specific to the particular plaintiff. The government would just have to stop that behavior, basically.
Yes, from what I can read from your papers and what you've said here, that limitation you say comes from this principle that if you don't do that, you would be somehow giving relief to non-parties. But I wonder if that's right. I mean, it seems to me that the relief is the judgment that you provide to the plaintiff that says stop doing this conduct. And you give it only to the plaintiff. That's where the limitation comes. The plaintiff is the only person who can go to court after you violate this order and enforce it. Other people are incidental beneficiaries of a court ordering you to follow the law. I mean, that's like everyone in the world. When the court says follow the law, anybody who would have been hurt by your not following the law benefits. Okay. I don't understand why that would limit the court in its ability to tell you don't do this unlawful conduct.
Two responses to that.
Yes.
There's a lot there. Two responses to that. One is that principle that your question referred to is the holding of the court in Worth against Selden, and it's reaffirmed in Gill against Whitford in Lewis.
Okay, people keep posting this.
So moments ago, the Trump administration just had the U.S. Secret Service come to my house. You might be wondering why. Because yesterday I made a post that said 8647, which means, if you look it up, get rid of Trump, as in impeach Donald Trump, as in 25th Amendment Donald Trump, as in vote Trump out of office. Why, you may ask? Because last night on the news, Donald Trump made the claim that 8647 means assassinate him, which it doesn't. I would absolutely never, ever call for violence against anyone, let alone the President of the United States. So the Secret Service agents were extremely friendly. They were like, yeah, we understand. It's just something we have to do because Washington told us to.
Oh, big mistake. Oh, he fucked up. He should have said that they came and they asked him questions that were violative of his civil rights, that they were that it was hours of questioning. Oh, he fucked up. He fucked up so hard there. Oh, no.
Washington told them to come give me a visit. That's what he said. Trump wants to be a dictator, and I will not be intimidated into not voicing my opinions or my dissent against him, ever. When Biden was president, multiple large social media accounts on the right used the term 8646, meaning get rid of Biden. But now they want to create this new meaning in order to go after people who disagree with them. We're not going to become a dictatorship. Keep fighting back in a non-violent way.
Yeah, non-violent. Clarify that. Good job.
Against Casey and similar cases that the authority of the federal court, whether it's viewed as arising under Article 3 or under its traditional scope of equitable authority, is to remediate the injuries to the complaining party. And then to address your question about...
Can I just stop you there? I'm, as the court, remediating the injury by telling the defendant to stop doing this behavior. The plaintiff has brought a claim that this executive order is unlawful. I look at it, I litigate it, and I say you're right. Stop doing it. You cannot enforce this order. So I don't understand why that's like outside the scope of Worth versus Selden.
If the court in that case is imposing what we've called an indivisible remedy, for example, vacator under the APA, there's a debate about what set aside means. Assuming it means to vacate, then the remedy that Congress has provided as a condition of its delegation to the agency is if one part of the, if the regulation is unlawful, then the remedy granted, which directly remediates the plaintiff's injury on that hypothetical, is an indivisible remedy that benefits others. Here in this case, and in all the other 40 cases, we see something totally different.
Yeah, I understand.
It's not necessary to remediate the injuries of the plaintiff before them. That is the
I understand. Let me just turn your attention to one other thing, because the real concern, I think, is that your argument seems to turn our justice system, in my view at least, into a catch-me-if-you-can kind of regime from the standpoint of the executive, where everybody has to have a lawyer and file a lawsuit in order for the government to stop violating people's rights.
Which is bullshit.
Justice Kagan says, let's assume, for the purpose of this, that you're wrong about the merits, that the government is not allowed to do this under the Constitution, and yet it seems to me that your argument says we get to keep on doing it until everyone who is potentially harmed by it figures out how to file a lawsuit, hire a lawyer, et cetera. And I don't understand how that is remotely consistent with the rule of law. A system, and I appreciate that you go back to English common law and the Chancery Court, but they had a different system. The fact that courts back in English Chancery couldn't enjoin the king, I think, is not analogous or indicative of what courts can do in our system, where the king, quote unquote, the executive, is supposed to be bound by the law. And the court has the power to say what the law is. And so one would think that the court could say, this conduct is unlawful and you have to stop doing it.
I think the catch-me-if-you-can problem operates in the opposite direction, where we have the government racing from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, having to sort of clear the table in order to implement a new policy. A great example of this is in the Schilling litigation, where the military had a military readiness policy. It was universally enjoined by the DDC. It went up to the D.C. Circuit. The D.C. Circuit stayed that injunction to allow that policy to go into effect, and then 1 hour later, a district court on the other side of the country universally.
Can I just ask you one final thing, because this relates to also something that Justice Kagan said. I would think we'd want the system to move as quickly as possible to reach the merits of the issue and maybe have this court decide whether or not the government is entitled to do this under the law. Wouldn't having universal injunctions actually facilitate that? It seems to me that when the government is completely enjoined from doing the thing it wants to do, it moves quickly to appeal that, to get it to the Supreme Court, and that's actually what we would want. What I worry about is similar to what Justice Kagan points out, is that if the government is saying no lower court can completely enjoin it, it actually means that the government just keeps on doing the purportedly unlawful thing, and it delays the ability for this court to reach the underlying issue.
Percolation of novel, sensitive constitutional issues is a merit of our system. It is not a bad feature of the system.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Mr. Feigenbaum.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. This court should deny the emergency application because this injunction was properly designed to ensure that the states would get relief for our own Article III injuries.
Wait, what was his answer? That was a good challenge. Shouldn't you want this to go as quickly as possible? What was his answer?
Thank you.
Percolation of novel, sensitive constitutional issues is a merit of our system. It is not a bad feature of the system.
Okay, I don't understand. Okay. I feel like percolation. I don't know. I don't know. Not a legal student, okay, but I feel like percolation is misused here. Like, I feel like there can be times when having a whole bunch of people writing on an issue, contemplating an issue, going through perhaps different cases with different sets of facts related to an issue can be a really good way of utilizing the entirety of the federal court system to kind of let these things, be figured out in a reasonable way. I think that that's true, but percolating on fundamental constitutional questions relating to something like birthright citizenship, that doesn't feel to me like a thing that is benefiting at all from percolation here. And then on the know if you'd say a balance of the equities or whatever. Like there's so much more potential harm in waiting on that decision than on trying to move expeditiously to allow the Supreme Court to figure out like, okay, well, is this a thing that we think is good or bad? But I don't know. That just seems... Oh, yeah, especially when that percolation is undercut due to the fact that if the government were to lose any of those cases are never, ever, ever being appealed. So they won't make it to the Supreme Court anyway, but whatever.